only if evolution is true, then we should find such a species with features halfway between modern humans and the apes that were known in Darwin's day. Thus, Johansen found what was then described as a missing link, using terminologies that we don't really use anymore, but that was the idea. And so when I was 12, 1974, yeah, I know I'm old, I remember seeing the news break that the missing link had been discovered, which amuses me that creationists are still today denying that that ever happened. Dr. Johanson, it is an honor to meet you, sir.
Well, happy to be on your program. Been looking forward to it.
All right, so when your name comes up, and whenever we discuss Lucy, it seems that an awful lot of people are not aware of Australopithecus africanus or anamensis or sediba or whatever. They only know of Lucy. They don't know that there's multiple fossils. They don't know that we have male and female specimens. They're just aware of her. And nope, be quiet, be quiet. I apologize for my dog. And the criticisms from people in some sort of denial over Lucy are, I think, at this point, laughable. And I want to bring up a couple that showed up early in the chat of this very show. When we made this live, or when we got this set up a day or so ago, someone posted these comments and said that, one, that Lucy is not a missing link. Not only did John Hansen himself, admit that the leg was found a mile away, and this person is accusing you of admitting on film that the human-looking hip had a drill bit taken to it, and that skull 1470, and I realize what they're referring to there is a completely different species, was a 230 million year old human skull. All of which is just laughable. But this is the kind of criticisms that I see whenever Lucy comes up.
Well, I don't know what they're smoking or what they're reading, but they're so far off the mark that actually even answer these questions. Humans go back about 6, maybe 7 million years, not 200 and some million years. Lucy's leg, whatever he means by that, either the thigh bone or the shin bone, were both found in association with the pelvis and the rest of the skeleton at the same site in the same stratum that was dated at 3,180,000 years ago, plus or minus something like 20,000 years. And indeed, every one of these fossils, one thing he's right about is that every one of these fossils is a missing link that we find. It was missing until we found it. And, the chain of evolution, as Darwin spoke about it, and so many others, is certainly made up of a lineage. You can't have descendants without ancestors, and vice versa. So over time, in Darwin's model, his true paradigm shift in the understanding of life for the planet, a very misused term, paradigm shift, but it is a paradigm shift when 99% of the world believed in some sort of special creation. There's a massive shift to a natural explanation that explains the diversity of life on the planet, and that includes ourselves. So one can look at every one of these fossils as some link in the chain, whether or not that is on the chain or lineage that arose to ourselves or gave rise to some other species of Australopithecus that died out. So we don't, of course, like to use the term missing link. I think that Ernst Haeckel, he was a great proselytizer of Darwin's ideas in the 1900s in Germany and on the continent. And he came up with a fascinating name, which he called Pithecanthropus, which means ape man, or ape men from the Greek, of course. And that reflected the idea that we would find something precisely intermediate between ape and human. And Lucy has some features that are very ape-like: a small brain, projecting face, particularly as you can see in males. They have a very projecting face. It's not a flat face like yours or mine. That's ape-like. It had a small cranial capacity. Lucy herself probably had a brain of about 2.5 cups of coffee or something, and was very small. But in terms of her postcranial skeleton below the neck, there's no question whatsoever now that they were walking fully upright like ourselves. And what Lucy's discovery and many others has pointed out to us is, yes, Darwin was right about the features that make us human, such as tools, big brains, upright walking. That didn't all happen in one magical evolutionary moment. We know that our ancestors first descended from the trees, started living on the ground, and for whatever hidden reason, uh, adopted upright walking. We've all fallen down the steps or tripped over a curb, or have fallen arches or hernias or whatever. It's not a perfect adaptation. But when we look around at 8 billion years, it's a pretty significant breakthrough that we're all bipeds. And only later did things like brain expansion and tool manufacture occur. He kind of set the scene by pointing out these very important points along the way of becoming human.
I think it amusing also that when people try to discount Lucy as an individual, as if you could discount that one individual, you would discount all of it. And they're not aware that there are hundreds of examples from this species, as I said before, of both genders, and not just her species, but also a handful of others, both for the graceful Australopithecus and the robust Australopithecines, which, or the Paranthropus, all of which would fall into Darwin's description of what a transitional species, where this missing link would be. And then on top of that, we have Sahelanthropus chadensis on top, we have way too many that we're even trying to discuss now. Which is the closest? Because maybe it's not necessarily Lucy. Maybe Sahelanthropus is even closer to the human evolutionary lineage than she is. But people always want to discount that one individual as if that means something.
Well, certainly, Lucy herself, the skeleton itself, represented a new species, Australopithecus afarensis, named after the Afar people in the Afar region of Ethiopia. And when I made my first discovery, the first discovery of a human ancestor fossil that was ever found in the Afar region in 1973, no one had found fossils like that before. It was a knee joint. And the anatomy, the biomechanics of that knee showed very clearly that whoever had possessed that knee 3.4 million years ago, the knee's a couple of 100,000 years older, was walking upright. We didn't know who it was. It took a lot more evidence to establish the fact that her species, or that species she belonged to, was highly sexually dimorphic. I mean, this is a lot of difference between males and females. There's a Lucy's jaw right here, and this is a male jaw right here. They're enormously different. And one would expect that because we look at our closest apes and we see that males are much larger than females, and it's called sexual dimorphism. But it wasn't until we assembled close to 300 specimens over numerous expeditions at Hadar itself, where she was found, in the same stratigraphic place, the same region that samples about 500,000 years of time, that we could see that there was continuous variation between largest to the smallest and vice versa. And that the details of the teeth, the details that matter, as Darwin and so many others have written, it's the details that are important. And they were significantly different from all other species of Australopithecus. Now, what that did was it recognized a new kind of human ancestor, which was a different species. But also what it did was it prompted us to think about how does that species fit onto the family tree? And what I postulated in 1981, actually earlier in 1978 at a symposium in Sweden, was that Lucy's species was the last common ancestor to two lineages that descended from her. One that led to these other Australopithecines you mentioned, the Paranthropus and the vegetarian forms, the robust forms, and also an ancestor to the genus Homo. Now, from a scientific point of view, that was a hypothesis. That was not definitive proof. And that hypothesis has been tested over ever since 1974 with additional discoveries. And additional discoveries have filled in the gaps between Lucy and the earliest Homo, and between Lucy and the earliest robust or Paranthropus species. So we're looking at, I feel very fortunate as a scientist to have made the discovery so young in my life, you know, being the old fart that I am today, looking back, that I've lived long enough to see my hypothesis tested and largely supported. And generally, I think the most widely accepted hypothesis or shape of the human family tree based on that discovery.
I've seen a number of complaints or criticisms from those who don't want to accept a physical genetic relationship to the other apes, to the effect that the claiming that Lucy was herself a hoax, and thus we could just dismiss every other example of her species and every other similar species and just pretend that none of that ever happened, which is a criticism that is so absurd it's not even worth a response. But
Right.
what I have seen, which I thought was interesting, is I've seen a number of creationists still today making the argument that Lucy was, and I've seen this from several people, from the Institute of Creation Research, from Answers in Genesis, and a number of others, to the effect that Lucy was just a tree climbing, quadrupedal, knuckle walking ape.
Yeah.
Can you address that real quick?
Well, I think that's, it's very, it does such a great disservice, not just to the science, but to the intelligence of most people who actually take some time to look at and read the original evidence for the conclusions that we have reached. For me, one of the most dismal expressions of this is at the Creation Museum. I believe it's in Kentucky, if I'm right. Is that right?
Yes,
Where
very
they've
near
got,
Cincinnati.
yeah, they've got Lucy reconstructed as a knuckle walker, like chimps walking on their knuckles, and a quadrupedal terrestrial ape. You know, they've also got, I think, Jesus riding a dinosaur there or something also, which is
They also have in their Ark Park. They have a number of reconstructions of theropod dinosaurs, but of course sans feathers, because they cannot admit that Maniraptor and dinosaurs had feathers.
yeah. You know, it does such a disservice to our educational system, the open minds. Uh, what I've noticed over the years, which is so interesting, is I've never run into kids in elementary schools, maybe because I'm not lecturing at creationist schools, but at any other schools where obviously a large portion of the audience, believes in Christianity or Judaism or Islam or whatever. They think this is one of the most exciting things, that, my gosh, we're related to the apes and that all humans are related to one another. They think that that's fascinating. They don't have this prejudice that others have against learning something new. And of course, right now, broadly speaking, our country and many other places are becoming very anti-intellectual. We see this with the COVID vaccines and so on. And from my perspective as an educator, I think there are very few problems on this planet that cannot be solved through education.
I'm
Probably.
going to turn. I'm going to turn the questions over to my wife in just a moment. But before I do, what I really wanted to talk to you about is that you're the many awards that you've received for different organizations for skeptical thinking, and since you touched on that already with with how we have so much anti-intellectualism in this country, which is of course the thing that I am most adamant against. Um, I want to continue in that same vein, but I want to get my wife a chance to ask some of her
Sure.
questions to you, and then when she's done, we're going to spend maybe another 20 minutes or so on questions selected from the chat.
All right. Happy to do so.
Can't hear you, dear. I think you're muted. Are you muted? I don't hear you.
I always say when I go out to lecture to a college or university, the most difficult part of the program is getting the audio visual to work.
Yeah, I know her audio was working a moment ago. Let me just go take a look at that. She's in the other studio.
All right. Aaron Ra, you had a nice conversation, I think, with the last director of the Institute of Human Origins, Bill Kimball.
I did, and I wanted to have him back on another project that what I was working on, and for whatever reason he was disinterested in addressing creationists, and I get where he's coming from with that, but
Yeah.
I see such an issue with Christian nationalism in this country that I feel that science does itself a disservice by not directly countering some of these idiots.
Well, it takes a very specially prepared person who knows how to debate these confused minds. And I think that Bill, and I've stayed away from predominantly also, but Bill, by the way, was a student of mine back in the early 70s when I was teaching at Western Reserve University in Cleveland, pre Lucy. So we've been colleagues and collaborators, and very, very.
Somehow I'm hearing running water. What is going on? Okay.
I think she's with us.
Lalandra, I think we got your sound back. Lalandra, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
This is in the living room, and the microphone was unplugged.
I was going to have them believe that we were in a penthouse studio, but you went and blew it.
Yeah. Anyways, my background is a science educator, and I'm interested in science communication. So sometimes I pipe up in these conversations when I feel like we're diving a little deep, you know, and I don't ever think that I have the more knowledge or understanding than a specialist and scientist in their own field. And I just wish creationists would come from that point of view too. I mean, like you were talking about Lucy, and she is 40% complete. So that is a saying that it's not doesn't mean anything against people who've actually studied it and found it and compared it to other fossils is the arrogance, the height of arrogance. But anyways, so my question is, I'm trying to situate in my mind Lucy amongst all the other human ancestors, and I'm not sure if exactly sure if she is a direct ancestor or a sister group to the direct ancestor of humans. So if you could
You know,
explain that.
you talk about arrogance. I mean, what do you
Yeah.
expect from Homo egocentricus? Uh, we, we are a species who thinks that we are at the pinnacle of evolution and
Mm-hmm.
that we are destined to be in charge by some force out there referred to by various names, depending on what culture you grow up in. And being a science educator myself, I think it's very important for people who are questioning the idea of evolution to understand that this, on our part as scholars, is a presentation of a theory that explains the diversity of life on this planet in the past, in the present, and in the future. And I very often in my public lectures state this very clearly, that this is uh, something that is based on solid observational fact that anyone and everyone can observe. And when I ask an audience at the beginning of my talks, I say, all of you who believe in evolution, raise your hands. And I lectured at the in Copenhagen recently for the Danish Natural History Museum, and every hand went up. But that's not the case here. But the audience, I always pause for a second and I say, well, it's going to come as a surprise to all of you that I don't believe in evolution either, any more than I believe in gravity. That it's a fact. It explains exactly who we are. It explains how we got to where we are, and explains how biological diversity and change over time came about on this planet. Now, I alluded to this earlier when I said that, from my perspective, Australopithecus afarensis, which is a widespread species in probably from Central Africa. I think there's a jaw in Chad that belongs to this species. That's about 3.5 million years old or so. There are the footprints and the teeth and jaws and skull fragments from Laetoli in Tanzania at 3.7. There are fossils in the Afar region of her species that go back to about 3.8 or maybe even 3.9.
The Afar region is in Ethiopia.
Yes, in
Okay.
Ethiopia.
Eastern.
And there are also good fossils in Kenya. So this was a long-lived and very widespread, one of the most widespread species of Australopithecus in the fossil record, and one of the longest lived species with the most dense fossil record of any species of Australopithecus. So we start with an enormous database. There are probably 600 specimens now, many of which have not been described and published, but this is extraordinary by anyone's measure. What I did in 1978 was certainly very provocative. And that was that I said that this long-lived, very generalized species, it wasn't adapted to a vegetarian diet like the genus Paranthropus. It was a vegetarian, but it still had, a fairly generalized set of teeth. It didn't have enormous teeth. It had, moderate-sized teeth. It had a small canine, so it wasn't like an ape. And I suggested that perhaps, since this was the only species of Australopithecus we knew between 3 and 4 million years, and after 3 million years, we see, not until 2 million years ago, the appearance of Homo and of Paranthropus. And what has happened subsequent to that is that a member of the Institute of Human Origins team, Kay Reed, and her team found a number of years ago a half a mandible or jaw that in the front has this kind of profile to it. It's actually easier to see there.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of sloping backwards, which is very afarensis-like.
Mm-hmm.
But in the back of the jaw, where you see how the third molar here is completely hidden by this, what's called the ascending ramus, it's very Homo-like back here. So it suggests that, on the one hand, the Homo lineage came out of Australopithecus afarensis. And on the other branch, we have fossils at 2.5 million years that have a very projecting face, which is very atypical of things like Zinjanthropus or Paranthropus or Nutcracker Man, whatever you want to call him, with massive teeth. It had massive teeth and an enormously projecting face and a big crest on the top. So with the crest, the massive teeth, it looks like Paranthropus, but the projecting face is reminiscent of what we see in Lucy's species. So my working hypothesis is, of course, that Lucy is the last common ancestor to these two branches and was therefore, evolutionarily a lineal ancestor to at least these two branches. And there is another branch in the middle called Australopithecus gari. And this demands explanation. We've made an observation. We've made a hypothesis. But what would be the explanation for this increasing diversity? And to understand that, we look to the paleo-environmentalists, people like Kay Reed herself predominantly, but others at the Smithsonian, and many people who, the fossils, hominid fossils get all the attention because
Mm-hmm.
we like to learn about ourselves and we like to think that, wow, we're so special. Well, she lived among all sorts of species of elephants and rhinos and monkeys and rodents and antelopes and gazelles and so on. And they provide very interesting clues for us about what the paleo environment looked like. And we know from looking at the kinds of animals that Kay Reed has studied, particularly the antelopes, but also at geological signatures in the geological rocks, that around 3 million years ago, there was the beginning of a significant change in climate. And I think that as Darwin wrote about this, we always go back to Charles Darwin. If only he could sit in the back of one of our classrooms, wouldn't that be a thrill for him and for us? But he suggested that, if everything stays the same, if it works and it's not broken, why fix it? We know a lot of people at home that try to fix things, and that happens. But it's the same thing in evolution. If the environment is the same and it doesn't change, the salinity in the water doesn't change, the pressure in the water, the temperature in the water, why would fish change? Why would we have, there are certain clams that have been around for hundreds of millions of years because they live in that climate hasn't changed. But when the climate changes, something called natural selection kicks in. And that's the biggest problem for the creationists. Where is natural selection? You can't feel it, you can't measure it, you can't weigh it, you can't see the test tube, it doesn't have a color, it doesn't have an intention. They say, well, this is all by accident. And it's not by accident. And actually, what I use very often I just had this experience Sunday night at a dinner party. And someone brought this up, and I said, I think it's easier to understand evolutionary change by forgetting the evolution of the fittest and talk about the elimination of the unfit. And all of a sudden, this light bulb went on, and he said, oh, yeah, I understand what you mean. Those that can't adapt go extinct. And that leaves the other ones who can survive in that environment. And as we look at the climate change, we see a tremendous change in the availability of foodstuffs. Like we see the spread of savannas, we see the diversification in grass eaters like baboons and antelopes that are migrating into these open areas and adapting to them. And here was some little lowly group of hominids looking out on that grassland and thinking, wow, what's going on out there? Well, some of them said, listen, I'm leaving. I'm not hanging around this neighborhood. I'm going to follow the forest. So they stay in the forests. And of course, we don't know what happened to them, even if they were already upright, because forests don't preserve fossils. But there were some who had that great human spirit and said, well, let's go out and see what's going on out there. And in order to survive out there, they survived in an entirely new environment where there was tremendous selection for intelligence. And they observed a completely different world. They couldn't reach up and grab fruit from a tree or climb up and get birds' eggs or eat nuts and berries and stuff. They're not available on the savannah. But they did notice, if they didn't notice, they were certainly run down and eaten by carnivores. And certainly someone somewhere at some time said, boy, what are they eating? And exploring one of these kills and began to develop a very significant change in diet, which demanded intelligence, cooperation, ultimately stone tools, which all together in a feedback cycle selected for intelligence. So I think climate has played a very important role. I think the fact that that variation within the species of early hominins was that, not all hominins today are Einsteins, and not all hominins are brain dead, right? Most of us are in the middle. But there's always someone out there, some guy in your high school physics class that figures out everything that you can't figure out.
Right.
Now, he doesn't mean he leaves more offspring than we do and leaves more genes. But 3 million years ago, if you could be successful at bringing in a high energy food rather than a low energy food, and providing enough energy for the hungriest organ in the body, which is the brain, your offspring are going to survive a little bit longer than others and probably leave a higher frequency of their genes in the population. So this is the scenario I've worked with for many years. That it's not totally fleshed out, but I know it's a long answer to your question. Was Lucy on the direct ancestry?
Yeah.
I think she was, but one of the
That's held up to scrutiny since the 70s too, right?
Pardon me?
That's held up to scrutiny since the 70s too, right?
Yes.
The Lucy afarensis is in the direct lineage of humans.
Right. And just to finish, one of the charms of science is it progresses with new information. Now, if it turns out that there is Homo found at 3.5 million years, we've got to say, maybe Lucy wasn't the direct ancestor. And we have to change our minds. It's not a personal ad hominem attack on me and my ideas. It's the revealing of new information.
If I may interject, you said that you don't believe in gravity. And it's just the same kind of, I have the same kind of perspective with regard to like Big Bang cosmology. Now, I'm not interested in cosmology. That's no diss against it, but I mean, I understand that Big Bang is the best supported theory. That doesn't necessarily mean that I believe in it. It certainly doesn't mean that I make believe in it, or that I'm going to try to convince myself of that. I'm open to you want to come up with another idea, I'm open to hear it if it can address all the same data as well. But that doesn't, because science is not a belief system like the believers trying to push on us.
And that's what creationists do. Like, can you hold up the jaw again of the afarensis?
Sure. This one?
And yeah. Okay. Like, they'll just look at the things that say clearly that jaw protruded more than human, jaws do, then it must be an ape. But they'll ignore the other things that make it more like a human jaw.
Yeah.
They'll ignore evidence that contradicts their priori conclusion. And the scientists don't do that. If there was a fossil, like you're saying, that was Homo before Lucy's afarensis, then people would revise. We're not going to hold on to it and believe in it like it's sacred dogma.
There are so many things I used to believe that I liked to believe that I found out were not actually supported. And you don't have to prove it wrong. With me, all that's necessary is that there isn't sufficient evidence to believe that it's right. And I've already let go of it.
Yeah.
If I could just rewind for a second. What
Sure.
we're talking about here with Lucy, for other people, and a lot of people already know because a lot of people who watch the program are science conversant, is that Lucy being the ancestor or perhaps a transitional species between the human and non-human ape split, because she's bipedal, and other extant non-human apes aren't. Some are selectively bipedal, but at times, but for the most part, they're not. And so this is what we're talking about. And scientists, I think, the first discoveries were in South Africa of Africanus, right?
That's
and
right.
and then East Africa and Central Africa, like Dr. Johanson is saying, there were discoveries of Australopithecus afarensis, and that's not the only species of Australopiths, but it is a very likely candidate for the transition to from our ancestor with extant apes today. And we talk about Paranthropus. That's an extinct group, a side group of Australopithecus that had more robust skulls, but maybe it had some traits that more human apes have, just like Lucy. But of course, all apes have similar traits, and we make these little distinctions, like we've got the bigger brains and stuff like that, and we've got a brain developed for language. But look at a dog. A dog has a brain developed for smelling. You know, who knows what their smelling is like, and it's a big portion of their brain. So with Lucy, what is like so pivotal, so much more like humans than other apes?
Well, I think bipedalism certainly is a key feature that separates her. Other species, older species like Ardipithecus, I don't know how bipedal Ardipithecus was, but Australopithecus anamensis, Auroran tuganensis at 6 million appears to be bipedal. And we have recently, and this is largely through the work that your guest, Bill Kimball, collaborated on, that we're noticing that while the anatomy of the brain, we can tell a little bit about the anatomy of the brain, where the sulci and the little ridges are. When you look at a brain, it looks like a rocky landscape. That the way those they were arranged was still very ape-like. But there's about a 20% increase in brain size in afarensis over the brain size in chimpanzees. Okay, average. And we know that the common ancestor was a very ape-like creature because we share 99% of our identity with the African apes. And you don't develop that in parallel or make that up. And we also know that from the similarities and differences, particularly in genetics, that the common ancestor to humans and apes is probably 7 or 8 million years ago. And we don't know exactly who that was because we haven't found those creatures yet.
So, like you're saying, the larger brain of Lucy, perhaps an adaptation to hunting, or life on the savanna.
Yeah, I don't think it was hunting at all. I think it probably is associated with evidence also for longer periods of childhood learning.
Mm-hmm.
that Kimball and others have written about, that there's a longer level of infant dependency, and that would reflect a longer period of learning. So we may be looking at changes in behavior. We don't know what those changes were, but we may be looking at the initiation of changes in behavior. And when it comes to the other sort of cardinal feature which distinguishes us, culture, there are questionable tools at 3.3 million years associated with in the same stratum where afarensis is found, but there's a great deal of debate about that. But by 2.6 million years ago, which fits into the model I presented, you've got good Oldowan purposely made tools.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean how did that happen? Because if we look at chimpanzees in West Africa, Darwin even knew about these things because of the Portuguese sailors. They noticed these human-like things that they didn't know what they were, and but these were chimps, that they were using rocks to break open nuts. And one can imagine an aha moment, a genius moment, where one of these early hominin ancestors, maybe Lucy's immediate descendants, or maybe some of her cohorts, is breaking up a nut with a rock, and a flake comes off, and all of a sudden, oh my God, I cut myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an aha moment. I mean, that could have happened many
Eureka.
times. Yeah, a eureka moment. We know that it may have happened many times, but once that happens, and you develop this feedback mechanism, you have bigger brains, better tools, better food, more highly nutritious food, and selection for more intelligence to become more dependent and more successful in obtaining that kind of food.
I was reading a little bit, and Australopithecus afarensis is not a weak pry point in terms of the fossil record for creationists. Like I think that there are even like evidence that from fossils that the young of Australopithecus, their brains grew more slowly than a modern chimpanzee does, but not as slowly as ours. And so this is where you're just not, conjecturing or speculating. There's evidence that the brain growth in this particular species is different.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I love that my wife came up with the idea for this show, that we get to interview some of the best minds in the world, and we could certainly exhaust an awful lot of time
Mm-hmm.
having you on. And if it would be a great honor if the next time I'm in Phoenix, if I could have a beer with you, that would be spectacular. But I don't want to abuse your time. We have some trolls desperate for attention, and I'm not going to give it to them. But we also have some people with genuine questions, and I'm going to let my wife take over now and give them some time while we have some left.
Okay.
Just as long as we're drinking IPAs, I'll be happy.
Wait, did you say that you didn't want IPAs?
I love IPAs.
Oh no.
Okay, well, I'm drinking. This is weird. See this shirt? This is a full-grown man. I thought it would appropriate for this show because this is their logo. This is the beer I'm drinking right now, but it is an imperial stout. I'll be happy to buy you IPA if that's what you prefer.
Well,
But I'll still be drinking a stout.
Okay. Here we go.
The dog has the first question.
Yeah, he does. He wants to come in. Okay. Someone did a super chat and they said, "Thank you for the great info. What do you know about Sahelanthropus chaddenensis? Sahelanthropus
I can't
chaddenensis."
say it now.
What I know about Sahelanthropus, a real mouthful,
yes,
is that it lived over 6 million years ago, that there are many people, colleagues, who think that it isn't necessarily a human ancestor. It may have been an ancestor to the apes, and that it lived in solely in, as far as we know now, in North Central Africa in the country of Chad. And I think what we need more extensive fossil remains to really understand what this particular species or genus is about. And most importantly, and it is rumored that there is a discovery of a femur associated with it, which would really tell us whether it was upright walking or not. And that's a critical clue. The foramen magnum at the base of the skull suggests that it's somewhat more centrally located than it would be in a terrestrial bipedal ape. But again, it's a single individual, and it's based on a reconstruction. And I would hope that my French colleagues, Brunet, who was worked extensively in Chad, will be able to go back and fill in that very important question about who Sahelanthropus actually was.
Okay. Next question. What spot in the world would you most love to dig, and why?
Well, at this stage in my life, probably Southwest France, where all the good food and wine is. But if I had an opportunity to strike out into new territory, I think that I would, instead of following my nose, I would follow the Rift Valley up into the country of Eritrea. And I have visited Eritrea. Some of my Italian colleagues have found fossils there. We know that the geology is good. The areas that are still landmined are not good to survey in. But I think that the eastern part of Sudan or up into Eritrea are promising places to look. And if I could organize an expedition of colleagues and equipment and funding and so on, I think I would be most excited about working in the country of Eritrea.
I just have to throw out, somebody accused me of lying on this show. I love this. This is the way the apologetics argument works, because they mentioned skull 1470. They don't even know the insignia for that, and then they say that that Homo rudolfensis was a 230 million year old human skull. No, it isn't. Look it up. It's not even 2.3 million. Get your facts straight and don't accuse me of lying. Sorry, I shouldn't have fed the trolls, but I did.
Okay. Next question, I guess. Can we ask our guest what are some of the most significant selective pressures that currently dominate human evolution?
Well, practically, COVID is certainly one of them. That is a pressure on the species globally, and there are people who are exposed to COVID and don't get it. There are others who succumb to it. Fortunately, we've come very far since the early cases, and except for all the ignorants who are not vaccinated, who are helping the species evolve, and yet they don't even believe in evolution. It's so ironic that the reason that we have all these strains is because the people who don't believe in evolution are actually helping it evolve. I find it just so ironic.
As do I. Yeah.
Yeah. And we are globally, we're a single species today. And a single species is interacting all the time, exchanging genes globally. And when we come up against something like disease, or like starvation, or like global climate change, we solve these problems not through our genetics, but through our behaviors and culture. I think that when you look at Neanderthals, for example, who are today, they're mostly in, in government jobs. But if you look at Neanderthals, they were cold adapted. I know there's a huge push on to make them almost equal to us in terms of their cognitive abilities and so on. I could debate that, and I don't want to do that here. But if you look at Neanderthal skeletons, they're different from our skeletons because they didn't have central heating, right? If you're living in Arizona and all of a sudden glaciers start coming down from the San Francisco peaks and Flagstaff, you don't grow hair in your body like some of these other animals. You turn up the heat. So in many ways, we're not super organic. A term that an anthropologist by the name of Alfred Kroeber used in my first anthropology book as an undergraduate. We're not beyond culture, obviously, because when you have something as active, efficient, aggressive, and thorough as COVID, millions of people are dying. Okay. But culture is solving the problem to a very large, to solving it by developing vaccines. So and once we have rises in sea level, I think it's ludicrous that we're going to try to build walls to keep out the Pacific Ocean, for God's sake. But we're going to move away from the beaches. We're going to move away from those areas. So today, we are solving these problems through cultural adaptations, not so much through biological adaptations.
I would like to extend an invitation, which you do not have to accept right now, but I'll present it in email, where you wanted to discuss Neanderthalensis and and how comparable it is to sapiens. I'd love to have that conversation, and I'll send you an email regarding that. Maybe we can schedule that for another time.
Yeah, I may defer to another colleague who I think who happens to be at the Institute of Human Origins. He works in Africa where there were never Neanderthals. He works on the emergence of anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, but he has, instead of a European perspective on human evolution, he has an African perspective. His name is Curtis Marion.
Oh, I know him. Well, I don't know him. He was one of my professors. He was one of my classes. I tried to get him on this show, but of course he's way too busy and important for a little peon like me.
Well, no, I think that we're going to urge him to follow in Bill's and my footsteps. He has a lot to say on this subject, and you really want somebody who is an expert not only just on, he's not an expert on anatomy, but he certainly is on behavior. And I would say that Chris Stringer at the British, it's no longer the British Museum of Natural History, it's the Natural History Museum in London. He's retired, but he's reachable through there. Chris Stringer has done a lot with Neanderthals. So these are people who are, to get the two of them on a show would be really fascinating. I'd like to be in the background.
I had the pleasure of being on a paleontological expedition in South Africa with Mike Day, who is also with the Natural History Museum of London. And it was a fascinating thing to be on such an expedition with some of the best experts from around the world. And I was fortunate that I just didn't stand on my tongue for any conversation that we had there. So I would love to have that conversation. I would love to have Curtis Marion on, but I've invited him a couple of times and haven't gotten an answer. So.
Yeah, South Africa is something we haven't touched on here, which is an interesting place because that's where the first Australopithecus was discovered it was published in 1925, and it was delivered to Raymond Dart in 1924. And there are new discoveries, more recent discoveries, like Sediba and Homo naledi and so on, and they're very peculiar creatures. And something we haven't touched on is the fact that Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, in my view, were really very separate evolutionary arenas. And you never find Boisei in South Africa. You never find Robustus in East Africa. You never find Africanus in East Africa. You don't find afarensis in South Africa. It looks like these were two evolutionarily distinct arenas of evolution. And even though, in my view, the South African fossils are not on the lineage to later hominids, these finds are terribly important because they show us the incredible inventiveness of natural selection. That once you have this transition to something that's walking around, it's not going to be the same everywhere because they can't get on a South African airline flight or East African flight and travel back and forth and exchange genes. But that's an aside. Let's go on with the question.
Could it be that those were kind of distinct ring species in South Africa and East Africa? Not kind of distinct. They're the same, genus, but
yes.
Yes.
Well, I think they're bona fide different species.
Yeah. Before we get to these last questions, I took a course in archaeology from Curtis Marion. It was just stunning for the people that I normally deal with. The people who are biblical literalists, and I'm trying to reach them. They have absolutely no idea of the wealth and breadth of information that they have in archaeology. There's just so much there that you'd have to deny all at once. It's stunning, the volume of information that is known that he taught in his course.
Okay. Next question. Here we go. Have you ever argued personally with a creationist? If yes, how would you describe it?
Well, I would describe it. I have, of course. You can't avoid people questioning you about these things. But when you find out in the first few minutes that their minds are made up about everything, they're not open to any new way of looking at anything whatsoever. It's fruitless. If they believe that the world was created in 5,000 years ago, or
last Thursday.
What's that?
Last Thursdayism.
Yeah, or there was something like a virgin birth or whatever. I mean, it's in my view, it's largely useless because I appreciate people disagreeing with me about, well, Don, and your hypothesis about this and that, and what about this fossil, and what about that fossil, and what about tempo and mode of evolution, and so on. That's rewarding, but when you're constantly butting your head up against people who think that we were divinely created and not brought here through the process of evolution, it's such a dangerous way of looking at the world. First of all, and most prominently, I mean, if we want a creator, if you have to have a creator in your life. I don't. I grew up as a total atheist. But I realized that I had a creator in my life from my earliest readings of Thomas Henry Huxley. And our creator is a natural world. And what I say to people who, they don't want to accept the responsibility for what humans are doing to the world, I say, would you be treating your creator the way you're treating what we really know is our creator, the natural world? And I think when people look at themselves, as I jokingly I'll say, Homo egocentricus, that we're the pinnacle and we were destined to be, and ignore the fact that our creator is with us every single day and we are still part of the natural world, when you stop thinking about that, you ignore it. And you don't care about it anymore. And all you want to do is take from it. and not listened to the messages that are coming to us from the natural world. So anyway,
what's interesting is they do take from scientists like you who actually find and look for the answers, and they take your findings, your fossils, and they cram it, they shoehorn it into what they already thought. If creationism were a productive explanation, you could make predictions and go find things like an Australopithecus, because like Darwin predicted, there would be transitional fossils. So, but what does creationism predict for us?
yeah.
That things came about abracadabra. How could you find that?
There's
Well,
also a perspective that we have that when you talk about a creator, I don't know what it is, what emotional attachment other people have to the idea that the universe was created just for them, and so that we humans are like the most important things that exist in 11 jillion galaxies, that all of it was created just for us. I don't understand how they can be that arrogant.
yeah.
The Buddhist belief that we should have a connection to all things, make me one with everything. I mean, that's the evolutionary perspective. We are one with everything in a very realistic sense.
I mean, I don't see the museum or the Institute of Creation Research getting National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health grants. And as far as I know, they've never created a single thing in their museum except obfuscation and confusion and misinformation.
Honey, can you bring just one last question and we'll let our guest go?
I think we're done, but just to wrap up, I think it's fascinating, not just direct ancestors of humans, but also the diversity in Australopithecus of all the different species. You know, it's like if you're looking for the direct ancestor of domestic cats, there's going to be a few side branches where that have some of the characteristics of domestic cats, but it maybe has an ancestor that we know. I don't remember it, but or that fossil could be erased by time. But to even have remnants of our human history and some of the side branches it took is fascinating, and it's like a whole different life that you're helping people to see. And
I feel incredibly rewarded, as I think all of my colleagues who are in paleoanthropology, to be living on the planet where we evolved. If it were 5, 10, 20,000 years in the future, we were on some planet somewhere, which I think is unlikely, but there wouldn't be fossils. And it is absolutely amazing that we, as the most curious, most intelligent species we know of thus far in the universe, they may be out there, but certainly on this planet, has this ability to understand their place in nature is something utterly unique.
Dr. Johanson, it has been a genuine pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
And thank you also for your contributions to skepticism. I think the Freedom from Religion Foundation gave you an award.
Yes, freedom from religion. We don't have that in this country.
Yes, we don't.
Our money. Yes. Why is it on our money? Anyway.
And also thank you for helping to flesh out the natural explanations for what really happened, rather than the creationists.
Well, have a happy holiday season, however one celebrates it, and all the best for the new year.
Now, do you have any projects or books that are upcoming?
Well, I'm dabbling in my autobiography, and hopefully that'll come out the next year or so.
Okay, we'll be looking for that. And you did a children's book also?
Pardon me?
You did a children's book also? A while back.
I did a children's book, yeah.
Yeah.
But the other project that I'm peripherally involved in, which is so exciting, is the NASA project that has just sent the Lucy mission into space. And there is a spacecraft right now flying at tens of thousands of miles an hour and solar powered, headed towards Jupiter, named the Lucy mission, to find evidence on the Trojan asteroids that they hope will enlighten us about the origins and formation of our solar system, just as Lucy has enlightened us about our own origins.
We didn't even mention in this interview that you have a planetoid named after you.
I do. I have an asteroid in the main belt, which is named the Donald Johanson asteroid, which will have a flyby in April of 2025.
I do see
Outstanding.
the connection though. Those are maybe much more ancient rocks than in that belt than we have
Yeah.
access to on Earth, unless one has crashed here, you know. So yes.
And
All right. Well, I think we have gone over our agreed time. So,
and the lenses on their cameras are made of diamonds. So Lucy is now back in the sky with diamonds.
Beautiful.
all right, Dr. Johanson, thank you very, very much for being on our show. It was wonderful to talk to you, and I hope to meet you in person.
Great.
Okay.
More than welcome. Bye for now.
Bye.